So today we're going to introduce basic lighting principles, and we're going to talk about the 4 things that really impact our vision and how well we see things. And we're also going to talk about the intentions of architectural lighting. And when we talk about architectural lighting, we're talking really more about artificial lighting, and we'll cover daylighting in a different chapter. So before we start off with some of our basics, the first thing we're going to do is talk about some visual phenomena. And so when we use the term visual phenomena, or you hear that term used, it's not necessarily what you see. It also has to do with how you perceive it and how you interpret it. So interpretation and perception, just like when we talked about aesthetics and taste and judgment, it's really based on you as an individual person. It has to do with your culture and your upbringing. And so how we see things through the lens of visual phenomena is really open to perception and interpretation. So those 4 basic principles that we wanted to talk about that affect our vision and how we see things are the level of illumination, contrast, size, and time. And we're going to talk about each one of these individually. So first, talking about level of illumination. So up to a certain point, when something is dark and we provide more light, a visual task gets easier for us, right? If I am reading a book and it gets dark outside and I'm having a hard time continually reading because I don't have a lot of light, I can easily turn on a light in my home, and that task gets a lot easier, right? It's difficult to read in the dark. It's easier to read when you have a light on. On the flip side of that, though, we have to be conscientious that too much light is a bad thing, right? So too much of a good thing is not a good thing anymore. So if we have excessive levels of illumination, we can actually have the opposite effect and cause a decrease in vision. So typically, 10 to 20 foot candles is required for adequate vision, and we'll talk about foot candles in a minute. And data suggests that when you get to 30 foot candles, there's not a lot of difference between 30 and whether I provide 30, 50, 70, 90 foot candles. I see about the same. When I get to 120, that's when my visual effectiveness starts to decline. So now something becomes so bright, it's starting to become blinding, if that makes sense. So I use the term foot candle, and that's just a basic unit of light intensity. And the textbook definition you'll see is the illuminance cast on a surface by one candela source 1 foot away. So to kind of describe that, it's the amount of illumination that's kind of within a 1 foot radius, kind of in a spherical shape. So it's kind of how much light is emitted in that 1 foot sphere, which kind of evens out to what we would consider a foot candle. Lux is another measure of light, and it measures illuminance, and that really measures more intensity and how we perceive it. So there's a little bit of subjectivity to the term lux as opposed to foot candle. But both are important of how we measure levels of light, and it's important to remember that the level of illumination is very important for us to see effectively. The second, probably most important factor when we're talking about visual acuity or how well you see something is contrast. And the example you see on your screen right now are 2 different sets of words, both say light. If I look at that low contrast example, the blue on blue, by the time you get down to the bottom there, the word light is really indistinguishable at that point. You can hardly see it. Whereas I can see it pretty well in a size, 60 font at the top there. Not really easily seen, but doable. But by the time I get to the bottom in a size 12 font, it's not happening. Whereas its counterpart on the right, the yellow, really stands out, and I can actually read that smaller lettering at the very bottom of the screen because I have a much more significant contrast. So contrast is a really important player when we're talking about how well we see something and how easy it is to see something. The third is the size of a visual object, and this one's pretty straightforward. As something gets bigger, it's easier to see, right? But as the size decreases, illumination, contrast, or time of exposure needs to increase, right? So if something's getting really, really small, I probably need more light to see it. I probably need more contrast, or I need to be able to stare at it longer in order for me to be able to gain the same information from it. And here's a great example, is the typical Snellen chart that you've probably all seen at the eye doctor, right? The T and the Z, easy to read, nice and large. But as you get further down the list, it gets more difficult because it's smaller, and you might take longer to decipher those words, right? So that would be time of exposure for you to, effectively and accurately read those letters at the bottom. Speaking of time of exposure, that is our last basic for how well we see something. Time of exposure deals with how long do I have to see and process something. And so a great example is our freeway system. So you might be saying, Miss M, I'm not trying to major in civil. I don't care about freeways and roads. That's not what I signed up for. But it's a great example. So these signs right here, quite large, and we'll get to that in a minute. And the reason they are so large is because you are driving down the freeway going 70, maybe some of you are going 80 miles an hour, and you don't have a lot of time to read, see, and process information. If the North Carolina DOT put an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper with size 12 font on that, on that structure, as opposed to these green signs, and you are going 75 miles an hour, chances are you probably couldn't read it, right? Because the time of exposure is so small when you're going that fast in a car. The letters and the size needs to be so much greater because the time is so decreased. So if you don't know how big those freeway signs actually are, here's a great example. So those guys are pretty small compared to how large a sign and words need to be for you to successfully read them with such a short time of exposure. So those are our 4 basics that define how well we see something. And we need to keep those in mind as we start to explore the purpose of our architectural lighting. So when we talk about architectural lighting as a whole, we have 2 main categories, spatial and task. Spatial lighting deals with kind of the general atmosphere, what we call visual ambiance. And visual ambiance is the overall tone of the space that's set by those lighting levels, the feeling or the mood associated with a particular place. Task lighting deals with visual performance. Do I have enough light to successfully and effectively do the task that I need to do? How well can I complete a task with the given light levels? So we're first going to talk about visual ambiance here, and here are just a few examples as far as what kind of mood or vibe do you get from this picture. Do you get something that is laid back and relaxed? Do you get something that's high energy? I personally feel like this gives me more laid back, relaxed vibe than something like this, right? An operating room. I'm not really looking for someone to be relaxed if I'm on an operating table, right? I have high intensity levels of light, and it gives the ambiance of it's time to get work done. Here, I don't want to get work done. I want to relax, the exact opposite, and you'll see the lighting reflects that. The other piece is visual performance. So remember, we had ambiance and then performance. And here we have a hotel reception desk, and you'll see there's a lot of overhead lighting that can be defined as task lighting shining down on that reception desk. And that helps the hotel staff get their work done effectively and efficiently. Back to our operating room, we have the fluorescent lights in the ceiling, but I also have these large task lights, right? Because if, again, I'm on an operating table, I want to make sure that doctor has enough light to see exactly what he's doing in an effective manner. And I think you would too. So when we talk about the overall purpose, typically in a commercial environment, we have both task and spatial lighting. And those should be addressed in every project, whenever anyone is doing any work. So here's an example of a lecture hall. And you'll see that spatial lighting for the overall ambiance of the room, kind of in those curvilinear light shelves on the ceiling. But you can also see those recessed lights that are directly above the desks, and those operate as task lights. And a best practice is for those two to be able to be operated independently. So the purpose of lighting is to have both effective spatial and task lights, but then in the design world, we also have intentions for things, right? We want to have goals and we want to have objectives. And light can typically be classified according to 6 different objectives. And the first is task. So when we're talking about task lighting, there's really only one objective, and that's enough light for the purpose of what you're doing. Do I have enough light to see what I need to see to do what I need to do? In spatial lighting, it's a little bit different. We can look at light for mood and atmosphere. We can use light to direct movement or show emphasis of something. We can use light to express use. We can use light to complement a structure, or we can use light to modify the appearance of a space. And each of these categories have, particular emphasis, but they definitely overlap. And we're going to look at some examples of those. So the first is our task light, enough light for the purpose. So when we talked just a minute ago that I can increase light levels, but at some point, increasing them is no longer effective. So a great example is a new refrigerator versus an old refrigerator. So looking at the picture on the right, what you'll see is like an old school refrigerator. So think, fridge on the bottom, freezer on the top. And then they used to have these lights that face the back of the freezer, right? And it's not really that effective. You can see how the front of things are kind of cast in a shadow with just the way and the direction the light is pointing. So if I continually increase that particular light, what it's really doing is adding some illumination to the back, but it's just creating a more drastic shadow in the front. So increasing that light level isn't necessarily effective. If I look at the example on the left, I see a new refrigerator, and I've moved the light source to the front, so it's more effective. And then when I increase that light level and change the temperature of that light, my visual acuity for finding things is directly impacted for the better. So lighting can be used to express use, and the main thing to take away from this category is that lighting systems can be very suggestive. They can suggest tone, they can suggest mood, they can define circulation and sedentary locations, and you can vary the different light levels in the same room to achieve different intents for activities. So here's a great example of this. If you look at this picture here, light helps us kind of define where activity spaces and movement spaces are versus sedentary spaces. So if you look, even on the ceiling, on the floor, that main walkway area is all this blue light, right? And where we have that kind of red, orange, yellow light are more congregational, more sedentary, more gathering spaces. You don't see a sign anywhere in this picture that says dance here and sit here. The light suggests that to us. Light can also help us emphasize things or direct us where we need to go. It's human nature that we follow light. So if we see a well-lit hallway, typically that's the direction we're drawn to. Our attention is naturally drawn to higher levels of light. When a particular surface is brighter than the ones around it, we're drawn to it. So that's something important to keep in mind if you want people to be able to focus or find something. Lighting for mood and atmosphere. Lighting is very critical when it comes to a space's perceived character, and this is the one that you're probably all most familiar with. Kind of looking back at that first picture when we talked about ambiance. That's what this kind of subset. Lighting for mood and atmosphere deals directly with ambiance, right? So lighting for mood can help form a relationship with spatial characteristics, noise levels, activities. And a good example of this is the two pictures we have on this slide. The Harvard University Law Library is very quiet, right? It doesn't give you a high energy, loud noise kind of vibe, even if I didn't tell you this was a library. Whereas on the right, we have a casino floor, and there's really nothing quiet about this lighting schematic, right? Nothing about this says shh. On the exact opposite, it kind of says, hey, come have a good time. Lighting to complement a structure is another really important aspect. We spend a good amount of time designing and defining space and creating these, really appealing visual elements. And without appropriate levels of light, our hard work might not be fully realized. So being able to have enough light to complement the structure and complement the design work, like in this photo, these kind of arches, right? These curvilinear support pieces actually become almost art-worthy, right? And I think that's greatly enhanced by the light and the shadow cast. The last one is lighting to modify the appearance of space. And with this, if any of you have watched HGTV or any kind of home renovation shows, a lot of times you'll hear things like, oh, it's light and bright and spacious and open, right? Because in general, a brighter space seems to be a larger space, and vice versa. A dark space tends to be smaller. So in those kind of before shots of the home renovation, you may hear like, oh, it's dark and cramped and small. And those words are typically associated with a darker space. So lighting can definitely modify the appearance of space. The rooms might be the exact same size. However, light might make you perceive that environment in a different way. So that's our basic overview of the basics of how we see things and how we use architectural lighting to our advantage in projects. And then